Hi everyone, very exciting week this week. Hanukkah's starting tomorrow night. Hope you're all ready, got your donuts, got your dreidels, because really that is the main part of Hanukkah, eating donuts, of course. But I thought I might take the opportunity to talk about the spiritual aspects of Hanukkah as well, because although it is mainly about donuts, there are actually some, more spiritual ideas connected with it as well. So I was thinking about the brachas that we make on lighting the menorah, and one of the brachas is She'asa nisim la'avoseinu. We bless Hashem for doing miracles for our fathers. Bayomim hahem, in those days, bazman hazeh, at this time. And it's a phrase that we say quite a lot. You know, every Yom Tov we say She'echiyanu v'kiyimanu v'hikiyanu lazman hazeh. We always talk about getting to this point, how wonderful it is, how amazing it is that we've actually got to this point, whatever this point is. And obviously this point keeps changing, but we seem to be linking it back to what happened back then. We say Bayamim Hahem, in those days, Bazman Hazeh, at this time. So it sounds like we're trying to connect the story that happened a long time ago to what's actually going on with us now in 2020. And it's difficult to do, but every Yom Tov, there's an idea that you should really not just talk about what happened then, but actually in some way experience it now. Try to relive it, try to imagine yourself as being a part of it. Now, obviously, this is very difficult because the story of Hanukkah took place over 2,000 years ago. So it's very hard to relate to it. You know, we know the story. There were some Jews and there were some Greeks and there was a fight, and, the Greeks far outnumbered us. And despite all this, we managed to win the war, and it was very miraculous. And there was a little jar of oil and it lasted for 8 days and it's wonderful. So we all light the menorah. Very nice story. But what's that got to do with me, really? I mean, how does that affect me in any way? So I wanted to talk about really what I feel the main message of Hanukkah is. And Yehuda HaMaccabi, the Jewish leader, he wasn't just fighting a physical war against the Greeks. He was actually fighting for the right to be Jewish, because they'd forbidden us from learning Torah, from keeping Shabbos, from keeping mitzvahs. And not only had the Greeks forbidden us from doing it, there was also an element within the Jews themselves. There was a group called the Tzedokим who had taken it upon themselves to alter the Judaism that we were keeping. They wanted to only keep the written law, the Torah Shebechsav, and ignore the oral law, the Torah Shebal Peh, which would mean a very different interpretation of all the mitzvahs that we know and love. So he wasn't just fighting for the survival of the Jews physically, he was actually fighting for the survival of Judaism itself. And we see that he's actually not the first person, or not the only person in our history to do this. As we say, Bayomim Hahem Bazman Hazeh, it does happen again and again, as it has a habit of doing in Jewish history. A similar idea or a similar story will keep taking place again and again. So I just want to touch upon a few more recent events that actually I feel make us able to connect to this idea better, because maybe they're a bit closer to where we're at now. So going, still quite far back in history, to 1492 in Spain, there was a very special group of people you may have heard of called the Marranos. And at the time, the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, had issued a decree in March of 1492 that all the Jews were going to have to leave Spain. Either they would have to convert to Christianity or they would have to leave. And if they didn't want to do either, they would be tortured, they would be put to death. And they gave them a few months to decide. And eventually, it was actually Tisha B'Av of that year, all the Jews left Spain. And it was about 200,000 people. They resettled elsewhere. And you can imagine it was incredibly painful and difficult to make that decision. It's not easy to just pick up and leave everything you've ever known, everyone you've ever known, the only life you've ever known. You have to leave some family behind, not knowing what will happen to them. And the people that got left behind, many of them were tortured or killed. But there was this special group called the Marranos who actually pretended to convert, but secretly remained Jewish. They'd keep keeping Judaism, but only within the home. They wouldn't do anything public. And even if you go to Spain nowadays, you'll notice there's a strong tradition. A lot of families light candles on a Friday night, and I'm sure they don't know why they're doing it, or maybe some of them do, but I'm sure a lot of them can trace some Jewish blood back to that time. And there's actually a community in Portugal in a place called Belmonte, where only recently, in I think 1970s, they started keeping Judaism again publicly. And for, if you think about it, the 1970s, after 1492, it's close to 500 years. They had passed down this tradition from generation to generation, and now they are Jewish. They have a shul, they have davening similar to ours, they keep Shabbos, they light candles on a Friday night. And it's incredible. They kept this secret for all these years, all these generations, but it was so important to them that even though it was on pain of death, and if they got discovered, they might have been killed, they couldn't let go of their Judaism. That's how proud they were to be Jewish. That's how important it was to them. And then going to our more recent history, it made me think of the refuseniks in Russia from the 1920s till about 1990. You couldn't practice Judaism if you lived in Russia, or probably any other religion for that matter, because your number one loyalty had to be to the state, and anything else was considered treasonous. How can you pledge an allegiance to anything other than Russia itself? And it was terrible. There were KGB everywhere. Everyone was being watched constantly or listened to. All these Russian spy movies, they were based on the real thing. There really were Russian spies everywhere. And later on, after the State of Israel was declared, obviously many of these Jews who were having a terrible time and having to keep all their Judaism in secret, they wanted to emigrate to Israel. And they put in applications to apply to move to Israel. And as soon as they put in an application to leave the country, the Russian authorities would immediately get them fired from their work. They had to lose their jobs. They didn't have any money coming in, and loads of them were arrested and rounded up. And probably the most famous was Natan Sharansky, who spent 9 years in a Russian jail, and the whole of the Western world by this point had heard about it. Probably earlier on in the century we weren't as aware, but by this point we knew what was going on, but we weren't allowed in. The Iron Curtain was still up, and there was very little communication with the outside world. They weren't really allowed to speak to us, connect with us. And during this time period, the Mossad actually were recruiting they were recruiting people from the West to go in, to travel into Russia to visit all these secret Jews who were still keeping Judaism in secret. And they needed that chizuk from the outside world, and they needed supplies, and they needed to know that we were there for them, even if we weren't actually there for them. And my parents actually traveled to Russia twice, in 1987 and 1989, when I was 1 and 3 and had no idea where they were going. And they had all these clandestine meetings with secret Jews where they were told everything would be listened into in their hotel room. They couldn't speak about anything. They had to write, all communication had to be done writing on a piece of toilet paper and flushing it down the toilet afterwards, because all the rooms were bugged. They pretended to be part of this tour group, and every so often would have to feign that one of them wasn't feeling well or something, and they'd leave the group for the day, and they'd have these secret meetings with. They had a list of Jews who they were supposed to meet up with, and they had supplies for them. They had tzitzis, and they had kosher food, and they had books to teach them Hebrew. And it was such a, source of strength for these people that, we were still coming in and trying to help them out, and that we knew about their plight. And thank God eventually it came to an end when the Iron Curtain fell. And I went to Russia, must have been about 2002. So it was about 10 or 11 years after communism had finished. And we went as a school trip to visit a Russian school. It was a Jewish school for girls, and it was a boarding school. It was actually an orphanage. And many of the girls there didn't have parents at all, or their parents couldn't afford to keep them. And they all lived in this school, and they'd become each other's family. And I don't think it even occurred to me at the time, but these children, some of them were in their late teens already. They must have actually been born during proper communism, and for what little time they were with their family, it would have all been in secret. They weren't allowed to be Jewish in public, and they had such an amazing attitude and such a love of Torah. And we went to learn with them, and telling them about the West and all the opportunities that we have there, and that thank God we've got amazing schools here, and that there's Torah learning available, and everyone's you know, completely publicly Jewish, and you can walk around wearing a couple. And, you know, it was amazing for them to hear about. And they were so committed and so warm. And a lot of them, friends of mine stayed in touch with them, and they did make it to Israel years later, and they ended up going to Sem. And they just had such an amazing attitude despite everything. And finally, I just wanted to touch upon the war, the Holocaust, when, of course, we weren't allowed to be publicly Jewish, and we knew that we'd be killed and rounded up, and we were being killed and rounded up. And I read an amazing testimony from someone's diary who was living in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was called Chaim Kaplan, and he writes that in 1940, when it was the first year of Hanukkah, that the wall had gone up, because it had only gone up a few months prior to that. So the previous Chanukah, they hadn't been able to celebrate, because actually without the wall, they could be observed the whole time. But with the wall up, you know, we think it's terrible that they had this wall around them, but actually with the wall up, they were suddenly afforded some kind of privacy, and they could celebrate Hanukkah for the first time. So they all shut their blinds, and they had all these Hanukkah parties and get-togethers to celebrate, because actually Hanukkah is the one festival where we're saying to the world, we don't care what you're doing to us. You know, you can torture us, you can kill us. If you don't let us be Jewish, then our life's not worth living anyway. You know, you can't take that away from us. We're incredibly proud of being Jewish, and nothing you do to us is going to change that. And it occurred to me that actually Yosef in this week's Sedra in Vayaishev, he's really the first Jew to live in Golis, because his brothers sell him into slavery, and he goes down to Egypt by himself. And can you imagine how he felt? He'd been rejected by his whole family. He'd been sold into slavery. I mean, I thought my siblings were bad. You know, we had this rule at home growing up that we weren't allowed to kick each other in the head with shoes on. That was like the #1 cardinal rule that you could not break. But we would never have sold each other into slavery. That would like really be very harsh. So, you know, his brothers is such a terrible thing to him, but he doesn't hold it against them or say, you know, I don't want anything to do with Judaism or Hashem anymore. He's not influenced by his surroundings. He doesn't become Egyptian. He actually tells them about Hashem. And, you know, he's got Mrs. Potiphar, who's coming on to him the whole time. And he's a 17-year-old boy alone in the world. And he resists temptation. He says to her, I can't do that. How can I do that in front of Hashem? And then he ends up in jail, and his life's just getting worse and worse. And he's got these two people in there with him, the butler and the baker, and they have these dreams, and he knows how to interpret them. And they're like, oh, well, that's amazing, you can interpret dreams. And he says to them, it's not me, it's Hashem. And he's like the proudest Jew, even though he's like this random slave boy in the middle of nowhere. No one else is Jewish. And he's being really badly treated, but he's telling the world about Hashem. He's still a very, very proud Jew. So what does all this say to us in 2020? We've got the most amazing opportunities. No one's telling us that we can't be Jewish. We're allowed to live as freely as we want. We can learn as much Torah as we want. Literally 24/7, you could be listening to a shir online if you wanted to. There's all these amazing chesed organizations around if you're not the learning type and you prefer actually doing stuff. There's just so many amazing opportunities to be Jewish and to be proudly Jewish. So I guess my message to you this Hanukkah is, let's embrace that. Give yourself a little treat, a little present each day of Hanukkah, that you'll do one thing that gets you excited about being Jewish, or that gets somebody else excited, make someone else's day happy. And you'll get that buzz as well of doing something and being proud to do it, whether it's a bit of extra learning or davening or calling up someone who's isolating or dropping around food or knocking on a neighbour's door who's elderly, who hasn't seen anyone for a while. Just do something and tell yourself, this is my Hanukkah, this is me being a proud Jew, because thank God we live in the century that we live in the place that we live in, and it's an amazing time to be Jewish. So enjoy it. Have an amazing Hanukkah and a good Shabbos. Enjoy the donuts.